I mean, Andrew and I have been friends. It did start with him reaching out. We play poker together. We've, are part of a sort of a group of friends, writers and poets journalists who just sort of have known each other for a long time. And well, it was always this idea. Again, sorry if I'm going over what he's already said, but there was this idea we would write a story together. And so we did get together and just kicked ideas around. And Andrew had this really awesome one that I was like, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. And so we wrote a short story about it, and then it evolved into a short novella. Then I don't even really know how the gradations are, but anyway, it evolved into something that was almost unwieldy, really. And then my editor read it and said, we like it, but it needs to be even longer. So this sort of, we had this long, I mean, it was pre-pandemic that we met to discuss the story. And so we've written it during the pandemic. His idea was this kind of malignant online handyman, and we've all, a lot of stuff, again, not to repeat myself, but to go back to what I first started talking about, like thwarted manhood. The idea of YouTube, first of all, is it's omnipresent. My son gets up in the morning and watches it, and we watch it. Just amazing how often you find yourself sort of going back to the weird siren song of YouTube. And there is a thriving industry for, like, my toilet flapper broke at some point, and I'm like, I can fix this myself because YouTube will help me. And it did. And yet I still felt like, compared to the person who was teaching me, I felt very much like emasculated is probably too strong a word, but I certainly did not feel on the level that he was. And I think I've always felt that way because my father was a banker, and, he could do minor fixes around the home just like I can. But if anything really hit the fan, he would call a handyman. As would I. I'm out of my depth very quickly. And the person who showed up, it was a weird inversion sometimes because, like, well, my dad is paying this guy, but this guy almost looks down on my dad because, like, you can't do it yourself. Like, what's the matter with you? So I'll do it, but let's hope the apocalypse doesn't hit because all the money in the world is not going to help you, man. So there's this long-standing sense that Andrew is really good at sort of pinpointing, and I certainly understood as well, of like the insidiousness of YouTube and that kind of online presence and how you can fall down the wormhole, married to this sense of like men of our generation and probably generationally period feeling unsure about how to shore up their houses, how to be a good and constant father, husband, a provider. And I think even more so, maybe in generationally, I noticed something that seems to be happening with my generation and even younger generations of men, is like women are they have much more influence, not only in the household, but just over the lives of families. When we were young, like my dad, when he got a promotion, the whole family would move. And it was never even a question, And I remember asking my mom when I was writing this book, like, Mom, she was a nurse. She's like a really talented and, intelligent person, and is to this day, obviously. Like, why did you put up with it? Like, why didn't you just say, Don, no, we're not doing this? And she said, Craig, on our block, every block we lived on, at, 8 o'clock, the men would get into their cars and back out and go to work. And then around 8:45, all the mothers would come out with their kids and take them to school. And it's like, I didn't know that was wrong because we were all doing the same thing. I could look up and down my block and see people doing the same thing that I was doing and feel like, well, this is just life. And now we realize it's just not the way it is, and I'm a stay-at-home dad because of my job. And, if our child gets sick, 99% of the time, I'm staying home because my wife has a job that takes her to an office and she needs to be there. And every so often, Jake, it flits through me that I like this terrible tension that, like, this is not the way my life should be. What is going on? And you have to manage it because it's like, that's based on, like, I'm not the man my dad was, but like the men of my dad's generation sort of were working from a stacked deck, and women got tired of it. So that's sort of, in a very long nutshell, that's sort of a lot of the stuff that was going into this, to the ideas that are present in that book.
I've known him for about a decade. My short story collection came out around the time a novel of his, Cataract City, came out, where was up for a bunch of awards. It was a big deal, but our names were getting mentioned together. And a friend of mine was like, "Oh, you should reach out to him. He's a nice guy." I'm like, okay. So I sent him an email. I was like, "Hey, man, I used to read your books when I was in the warehouse. I remember reading Rust and Bone, like sitting on a box of nylon rope, having to fend off guys being like, 'Why are you reading, college boy?' And be like, 'Dude, I can teach you to read if you don't know how.'" But reading that book, and then I was like, "I'd love to, just we both have books now. It'd be nice to meet you." And we met up, and he's just a very down to earth, sweet guy who immediately we had a good rapport. He tried to invite me to a Christmas party. He wasn't allowed to, so he got in trouble. And he was like, "Oh, I'm sorry that happened. How about you come to my poker game?" And that's kind of how we became friends. And, over a decade, just sort of, we lived in the same neighborhood in Toronto, and we kind of just had a similar interest in the kind of books we read. We read stuff all across horror, through lit fiction, everything, crime. We didn't really care too much about genre as like, oh, this is all I write. It's the only thing I do. Like, no, we're beyond that. But he was also just a good mentor to have there when shit was going bad and books weren't selling. And, his career has been all over the place, but he's always been consistent. He's always writing. He takes it seriously. And probably like 8 years in, he was like, "Hey, do you want to write a short story?" And I was like, "Yeah, let's do that." And we met up, and he was like, "Okay, I have this idea of a box in a basement." And I was like, "Great, let's start there." And then he had a second kid, and he was like, "All right, we'll work on this in like a year or two." And then, yeah, we wrote like a short story. We sent it to his film agent, just being like, "Hey, we want to send this to magazines. Maybe you're interested." And he was like, "You guys should make this a novel. You should, like, this is more than a story. There's a lot going on here. I think you should write a novel." And usually this guy's like, "No, it sucks." Like, so we took that seriously. And we wrote a novel about, yeah, basically a demonic do-it-yourself YouTube channel.
If I feel like I'm cackling like an idiot, my wife comes upstairs and finds me either in tears, which sometimes will happen, that's a sign that I think the narrative is progressing in a good way for me, or I'm laughing like a hyena. Both of those are good signs, and I think with some of this stuff we're talking about, like, you take any sort of male trait or female trait, gender specific kind of traits, to their furthest sort of satirical limit, well, they get funny, and we have a scene there in Home Depot. And I think almost every regular house owner guy feels somewhat ambivalent sometimes about a trip to Home Depot, because yes, there's the aspirational thing. I'm going to fix my house. I'm going to shore up my homestead. This is great. But you also encounter people who are like professionals and really good at it. And they know exactly what, this T-square is for, and this thingamabob, and this S-clamp, and they know what this tool is best for, and this saw you'd never use for this. It's just this whole sort of panoply of endeavor and of knowledge that most of us don't know anything about and are shut out from. And as long as we don't have to, be confronted with it, we're fine. So, scenes like that, where you just take something that is sort of a latent male fear and you nurse it to the point almost of absurdity. And such as satire, right? And it can maybe go too far. Satire is it's a subtle knife. You can cut too deep or cut too shallow. But no, those were the things that I was having a great time with it.
Craig had kind of come to me with like, okay, there's this box in a basement that, somebody wants, but they're not supposed to have. like a kind of cursed object, right? Where it's like, do not enter, do not take this, but all it does is make people want it. That was just a very loose, like, oh, let's play with that idea. Let's, genre is often about reinventing this stuff or repurposing it. And then I had, you're on YouTube and like 7 video, you want to watch like a live Stevie Nicks performance, and then 7 videos later, it's like Alex Jones yelling at you. And you're like, how? No, I didn't ask for this. I am not the audience for this. But just how the algorithm can kind of just take you away. And even, Google doesn't really understand it sometimes. They're like, well, we set it up and it just sort of lives now. And I'd seen stuff like unedited footage of a bear, which was on Adult Swim. which was this sort of like, it starts off with bare footage and then becomes a commercial for an allergy medication that goes off the deep end. And I was like, all right, you know what? Let's play with this. I just moved into a house that needed some work. So I was looking at some of these videos too, being like, is that how I get a squirrel out of the soffit? Really? Is that and just the personalities in strange ways, and like how you'd find sometimes the most helpful video only had 35 views, you know, like because it was just delivered straight. It was 30 seconds. Like, this is how you fix a tap, done. Not a half an hour of like, hey guys, welcome. We're here to like show you the best way to make a tap turn on. So we were like, okay, how do we make this? So it was really about a man versus a house, and sort of like exploring like, you know, all the ways that maybe men are being kind of put into a position to be like, oh, you can't do this. You're a failure. You never were taught this by your father. What are you going to do? And so this YouTube figure appears as sort of like a helpful presence, but there's something like more malevolent behind that. And we wanted to play with that. And so I kind of brought that to the table, the like online portion of it. And we just kind of ran with it. We kind of, you know, we wanted to explore a guy who's, you know, kind of empty and looking for an identity and finds it in the wrong place, without being didactic and being like, oh, and it was Alex Jones. Like, no, it wasn't. Like, moving, like, we made it this DIY thing. It is a broader thing. We wanted it to kind of resonate beyond, you know, a year. We wanted it to be a story that makes sense. And there's a parallel story in it too, of his son also being taunted by, you know, a different online presence, and just how you don't really know what is on the other side of the camera or the video. You think you know, you're watching it, but you don't really know. So updating the haunted house in that way to be haunted, like almost through the wires, through the air, from an outsider that you're inviting into your home too. It kind of has that vampiric thing too, where it's like you're inviting this presence into your home, into your life, into your child's life. How do you get it out? How do you let it go? And so it just kind of grew from those seeds. Like, they felt really resonant, and like we had a blast writing it. Like, I'd write 500 words, I'd throw it to Craig, he'd write 500 words. And then, you know, we get longer because we're more comfortable. So by the end, it's like, I'll write this chapter, you write this chapter. But early on, doing that 500 word switch, you really get comfortable and familiar with each other's voices. And we do kind of have a cohesive voice for Handyman that isn't really like Craig and isn't really like me. And we've been able to walk that line.